Welcome to all our attendees for today's webinar on Securing Exchange and Lync 2013 with Multi-Factor Authentication. For those of you who just arrived, I've pasted the link to download today's slides in the chat bar, so you can simply click on the link and download today's slides off of there. Netcom Learning has made today's webinar possible in collaboration with Kemp Technologies, a gold-level Microsoft partner specializing in communications and messaging technologies. It's a pleasure to introduce two keynote presenters from Kemp, Jung, who is a research analyst at Kemp Technologies, and Bhargav Shukla, Director of Technology at Kemp. I'll hand it over to Kurt in a moment. As always, I'm going to go over a few slides. Everyone has been muted, so if you have any questions during the webinar or at the end of the webinar, please type the questions in the questions bar. We'll address all your questions at the end of today's webinar. You also have the option to adjust your screen size. So on the top left corner of your GoToWebinar viewer, there's the zoom feature that you can use. So you can click on that link and adjust your screen size to your liking. And that's all I have for now, and we're going to jump straight to today's webinar topic. And Kurt, I'm making you the presenter now, and you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Rinchin. Okay, thank you for joining the webinar today, Securing Exchange and Lync 2013. Once again, I'm Kurt Jung, Research Analyst at Kemp Technologies. And joining me is Bhargav Shukla. He's the Director of Technology at Kemp. For those of you who are not familiar with Kemp, we develop load balancers and application delivery controllers. We offer a variety of solutions based on either hardware, virtual, bare metal, or cloud. We've been around since 2000. We have over 20,000 clients worldwide, really helping them by providing infrastructure availability, better web performance, securing operations, meanwhile streamlining IT costs. So if you're currently not a customer or haven't looked at our offerings, you really should take the time to check us out. You go up to kemptechnologies.com, you can download a free trial, kick the tires, and really see what our solutions are made of. Okay, let's start off looking at the agenda for today's webinar. We're going to look at about 50% presentation, then the other 50% looking at the components, the configuration, and the end-user experience in a demo. So first we're going to look at multi-factor authentication. We're not going to cover all flavors of MFA today. We're primarily going to focus on Microsoft's solution and discuss what's possible and what, of course, is not. Next, I'd like to discuss the use of certificate-based authentication and why organizations are looking to leverage this. Following that CB8 discussion, I'd like to look at Active Directory Federation services and where this plays a part in the multi-factor authentication scenarios. And finally, like I said, we'll go through what the configuration and end-user experience look like with a demo of multi-factor authentication for both Lync as well as Exchange. And of course, at the end, we'll follow up with any Q&A should any questions arise during the webinar. Okay, so what is multi-factor authentication? Well, most of us are familiar with this, but we'll just kind of do a quick review. It comes down to having really two or more of the following. There's what you know, right? The authentication we pretty much use every day, username and password. Unless you have a really complex policy password or complex password policy, these tend to be really pretty weak, right? Now, on the other hand, if you enforce a complex policy, you need to hire a full-time support staff just to help all the users reset those passwords that they forgot. So this kind of tends to be pretty much a hard balance to keep. Then there's what you have, right? A smart card or a CAC, common access card, primarily used by government agencies, Department of Defense, or a safe fobs, or maybe even your smartphone. Now, once again, the area we're going to focus on today is how Azure is leveraging smartphones with their multi-factor authentication solution. And finally, there's what you are, right? Biometrics, such as fingerprint or voice recognition, things like that. Okay, so Microsoft is providing a multi-factor authentication solution in Azure, which leverages the phone factor acquisition they made back in 2012. You're basically leveraging either a phone call, a text, or an app to be used as that second authentication method. Now, the solution can obviously be used within Office 365 subscriptions to secure email, Lync, SharePoint, and the cloud. It can also be used to leverage other services that are deployed within Azure, and even in addition to that, you can secure software as a service offerings such as Salesforce, Dropbox, and there's many others. I think at this time there's over 2,400 applications and services that support Azure Active Directory and therefore can leverage the MFA. But the service can also be used to secure on-premise applications, such as Exchange, SharePoint, securing VPN, ADFS, remote desktop, or even using the SDK to integrate into some of those custom applications you might be running. Now, this requires an on-premise server to be deployed. Conveniently, that's named the Azure Multi-Factor Authentication Server. Now, this server can also be set up on-premise in high availability, giving you that redundancy that you're going to need. Okay, like we discussed, there's three options for the Azure Multi-Factor Authentication. You have the MFA app, right, which is available on Windows Phone, Android, or iOS devices. Now, there's two modes that you can use the app in. There's the notification, right? This is done with a push notification to the phone when the user initially signs into the application they're trying to access. The user is presented with the option to accept or deny that second factor authentication, as we can see in the image there on the slide. Now, there's also an option to report fraud. Should the phone be ringing when you're nowhere near or thinking about accessing these systems, you can report fraud back to your IT department. Now, the second mode in the app is a one-time passcode. Right? The app will act as kind of like a software token to generate a passcode to be used to enter along with the username and password. It's kind of similar to the RSA solution out there. Right, now, the second option is using an automated phone call. Now, the Azure Multi-Factor Authentication Service will call the number you specify, and then the user can press pound, which will complete the sign-in process. Now, this is actually the option we're going to be demonstrating today as part of our demo. And the last option is a text message. Again, sent by the Azure MFA service. The user is prompted to either reply or enter a passcode, similar to the one-time passcode within the app. Now, today, Azure MFA is supporting browser-based clients, Outlook Web App, Exchange Admin Center, SharePoint, etc. Those non-browser-based clients, such as Outlook, ActiveSync, they're going to require some other means since they don't currently support MFA natively. Microsoft has put out this app password to fill in this gap in Office 365. Now, the app password, it's a system-generated password, therefore it's complex. Right? You can use it in place of your typical password in those non-browser-based clients. Now, you can create an app password for each client type. One for Outlook, you can do one for ActiveSync, one for Lync, and so on. You can create up to 40 different passwords, so there's a ton of room there. Now, I have to stress that the app password is only for Office 365 services today. Right? If you're running hybrid or you're doing an on-premise environment, you're not going to be able to play with this. Now, the MFA native support for these clients, it is coming. Right? The latest Office updates are in private preview, and they're going to be available to support this in Office 365. This is kind of all part of Microsoft Mobile First, Cloud First strategy. So when it becomes available on-prem, I really don't know. But what we do know is that it's going to be using the Active Directory authentication library. So what this is going to do is going to present the user with kind of like a browser-based authentication, like a web page, where they can do that two-factor authentication. And once again, we're going to have to see how this all plays out, both in the cloud as well as on-premise. Now, I just want to take a second and talk a little bit about certificate-based authentication and why organizations are using this solution. I mean, first, there's many applications where it makes sense to use certificate-based authentication. Most times, search CBA, it's a preferred method over using, say, the username password method. Connecting through VPN, BDI environments, wireless, so on and so forth. But obviously, since this is an Exchange and Lync conversation, we'll look at CBA for Exchange and really specifically now for ActiveSync. So using certificate-based authentication for ActiveSync, it's being used more and more. With the requirement to change a password, say, every 60, 90 days. I mean, if you're lucky, and then having to update that password on multiple devices. You have your smartphone, you got your tablet, you have your other tablet, and so on. It really becomes inconvenient for all users. Now, enabling CBA for ActiveSync addresses this, right? So, changing a password have no effect on the ActiveSync devices, since the authentication is really being done by those certificates and no longer username password. Now, one thing to note is that this feature, it's not available in Office 365 today. So if you're looking at CBA, it really needs to be done on-premise, right? And there's many MDM solutions, the mobile device management solutions that are going to help you manage these devices and the certificates that are being used for authentication. But let's be clear that CBA by itself, it's not multi-factor authentication. I guess you could argue that if you're using CBA for ActiveSync and you've enforced an ActiveSync PIN policy to lock users' devices, you could say there is some level of MFA there. Now, you can use CBA for accessing Outlook Web App and Exchange Admin Center. At Kemp, as part of our single sign-on solution, we do support certificate-based authentication, at the load balancer. We're supporting client certificates, say from your internal CA, smart card, including CAC. What we can do is when we get into the demo, we'll take a peek at this configuration. Now, also, certificate-based authentication with Lync is supported by doing what's referred to as passive authentication. Right? What this does is this directs users to authenticate to Active Directory Federation services rather than Lync itself. So where does ADFS fit in? Well, let's dig a little bit deeper into this passive authentication with Lync and how it directs users to that ADFS environment to do the claims-based authentication. So this authentication on ADFS, you can use what right, the username and password, along with what you have, such as a smart card, client certificate, user certificate, or even the Azure multi-factor authentication service. Now, what happens is the client, hits the Lync front end or director if you're running some in your environment. They're directed to ADFS for authentication. Once they're authenticated, they're directed back to Lync for services. Now, Lync Mobile, it's supporting certificate-based authentication, but Lync Phone Edition today is not supporting this. Right? I mean, passive authentication in Lync is kind of set globally. So if you're using Enterprise Voice and you have Lync Phone Edition, this may not be the right choice to go with here. So one thing to add is that also when you do enable Lync passive authentication, there is going to be some loss of integration features. The unified contact store for one, skill search, some of the exchange calendaring are just some of those features. So you really want to take a look at that before you go forward and enable this. Now, passive authentication is also supported by Exchange 2013 SP1 with ADFS. Right now it's for Outlook Web App and of course the Exchange Admin Center. So there's really two components of Active Directory Federation servers, Active Directory Federation services. You have the ADFS servers, right? They're domain joined. You have multiple servers for high availability. Conveniently in our slide here, they're being load balanced by our Kemp Loadmaster. Web Application Proxy is the other server, right? And this is formerly known as the ADFS proxy. This sits in the DMZ. It's in a work group, and once again, can be set up in an HA fashion. Now, having this type of configuration, what it does is allows you to have different authentication methods, depending on where the client originates from. For users that are originating from outside the network being sent through the web application proxy, we may want to have username, password, plus do Azure multi-factor authentication. Now, for users that are inside, maybe you just want to do Windows authentication to pass credentials rather than prompting them or doing any kind of MFA. Once again, we'll take a look at this as part of the demo. So speaking of which, let's take a look at the components, some of the configuration, and the end user experience with some of these solutions. Okay, so let's start off with the Azure portal. That's kind of where it all starts anyway. So within the Azure portal, I'm going to scroll down, and we have our Active Directory navigation here. And within that, we have the multi-factor auth providers. Now, right now we have two providers in here. We're just going to focus on the top one, the Kemp demo ADFS provider. So go ahead and manage this and kind of look at some of the reporting and configuration we have available. Okay, so we have some reports. We can look at some usage reports, based on summary, details, things like that. You have time frames. You want to look at someone's user, someone's phone number. You can export them to CSV, all that good stuff. Our server status, right, which is our on-premise server. It's online. Shows the last communication time, whether it's the master or a secondary server with that high availability that we were talking about before. We have some reports on fraud alert that we were talking about, and we'll get into a little bit more of that configuration. So within the configuration here, you have some settings that you can, for instance, change the caller ID number here. You would want to change it to your help desk phone number, right? So if someone has an issue or something like that when they're trying to authenticate, they could bring back that phone and really get someone within your organization to help them out. We also have some timeout settings for the text messaging, some settings to enable or disable the fraud alerts here. We also have the option to do account lockout. You can lock out the account if there's so many failed requests. So we have some other settings. We can customize the voice messages. So you can more personalize it based on your organization, or just use the default one, which we'll hear later on in our demo. We have some notifications where we can send an email address or distribution list or something like that for those fraud alerts or the account lockout notifications. And then down here we have our downloads. So we have obviously the server download itself, kind of shows you what platforms that they run on, as well as generating this activation credential. So when you're deploying the on-premise server, you need to launch this trigger here to get these credentials. And the credentials last, I think, like 10 minutes or something like that, and then they're void. But those credentials will get that connection between the on-premise server and the Azure MFA service. And then, of course, we have our SDK downloads, and as you can see, they're available in a variety of languages. Now, one thing to note about the SDK is that today, if you were using the SDK to do multi-factor authentication, you're only going to be able to use the phone call or the text options. But you're not going to be able to use the app for this. It's just not supported today. So let's jump on to our on-premise server and look at that side of the configuration. So here's our on-premise server. Right. So here's our multi-factor authentication server. And we have our status. Once again, here's our server name online. We have some company settings here. So you can set user defaults, again, languages, things like that, just kind of the general configuration of the server. We have some directory integration. We're obviously running this in Active Directory, so there really isn't much configuration you have to do with that. But you can use other LDAP environments and and set those connections up to that as well. We also have our users, which again, in our case, were imported from Active Directory, and here you can enable them. As you can see, we have a few in our little demo environment here enabled. They give you some templates for email, right? So when you're enabling users, you can have these emails triggered automatically to be sent to users, give them an idea of what to expect when they're using this multi-factor authentication and things like that. And then you have some other, IIS authentication, so the SDK, Radius. We'll take a look at a little bit later. But let's focus here on the ADFS. So we talked before about the Lync passive authentication being sent to ADFS and how ADFS is doing that authentication. So what we've done is we've taken our multi-factor authentication server and installed the ADFS adapter on that ADFS server. So we've just enabled it, and basically at this point only allowing the phone call option to be used as that second factor authentication. So within our ADFS configuration, right, here's our ADFS server. We have, we have our we have our relying party trusts. Right? So we have our Lync front-end servers, and actually in our environment we are using directors. So we've enabled, set up all of these connections to this our back-end Lync environment. And then we have our authentication policies. Right, now there's two ways to do this. You can do it per relying party. Right? So down here you can set this up, but as you can see in our environment, we're only using our ADFS server for Lync. So we're setting our authentication up at a global level. So let's go ahead and edit and look at these settings. So here's our authentication settings for our primary authentication. This is what we were talking about before with that the ADFS servers being internally and then those web application proxies being externally. So you can select how you want the user to authenticate based on where they're originating from. So again, you can do a Windows authentication on the internet, but maybe do forms or even certificate authentication on the internet or extranet. Then we have our multi-factor tab. So here we could set, who is required to use multi-factor authentication, down to a user or a group. You can add in there and make sure that that requirement is there for those users. We have location. Do we want to have multi-factor on the internet or not? And then you have then here what authentication do you want to use? Do you want to use certificate-based authentication as the second factor, or do you want to use the Windows Azure multi-factor authentication? So let's take a look at what the user experience is. So here we have our Lync client. We have it's got Bob that's going to sign into Lync here. So he'll go in and sign in, and what's going to happen is Bob's going to be presented with this web page for authentication, right? So this web page is coming from the ADFS server. So we can put in our credentials here, our super complex password, and sign in, right? So we've passed our first method of authentication, right? So we're at this point in time. And now what we can do is we can do this second factor or multi-factor authentication with a phone call. So just click continue. And here's the call.
Thank you for using Microsoft Sign-In Verification System. Please press the pound key to finish your verification. If you do not initiate this verification, someone may be trying to access your account. Please press £0 to submit a fraud alert. This will notify your company's IT team and block further verification attempts.
Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and press pound.
You have been signed in. Goodbye.
And we're off to the races. We're logged into Lync, and we are all set. Now what I'd like to do is let's look at Exchange. Now, the way we're going to do this with Exchange is quite different. We're actually be using our load balancer to do this type of authentication. So let's get into our load master here. For those of you who are not, again, familiar with our product line, this is our interface for our load balancer. So under virtual services, we have what's called single sign-on domains. So here I have a couple single sign-on domains set up. This one here, we'll just quickly look at it. We're talking about that certificate-based authentication. So here we have a single sign-on domain set up for certificate-based authentication, which is, as it states here, on the client side. Right? So on our client side, we're doing certificate-based authentication. And then on the server side, we can do Kerberos, constrained delegation. So we can do the KCD on the server side, the certificate authentication on the client side. But let's take a look at this MFA single sign-on domain. Right? So our authentication protocol here is we're using Radius. Right? So we have the options, as we saw, certificates, LDAP, RSA, but in this case we're going to be doing Radius. And our Radius server, this IP address is actually the Azure multi-factor authentication server, because when you enable the Radius authentication, MFA becomes a Radius server. We fill out our shared secret, right? We have our domain name and then our logon format. And that's it. That's all you need to do for this Radius configuration. Now, we need to apply that single sign-on domain to our virtual service, right? So here we have all of our workloads. We have our Lync, we have Lync reverse proxy, we have our web app servers, ADFS servers. But let's take a look at our Exchange. Now, our Exchange is set up with multiple, a virtual server with multiple sub-VSs underneath it. So we have a sub-VS for ActiveSync, auto-discover, web services, OA. Let's take a look at the OA one. Right, so Outlook Web App, we have this ESP option, which is our Edge Security Pack. Right? So within our Edge Security Pack, we can do authentication at the load balancer. So what we've done is we've said we want to do forms-based authentication, and we want to use that MFA SSO domain to do that Radius authentication back to our MFA server. So let's go open up a browser here. Kempdemo.com, and we're going to get our form based that we set up for Outlook Web App. Once again, we'll log in as Bob. And so what's happening is it's sending it back to the Radius server, which is the MFA, which will trigger that call to the service. It's a call. Press pound.
Thank you for using Microsoft Sign-In Verification. You have been signed in. Goodbye.
Okay, right. Well, actually what we have with this also is what we're adding is a timeout session, because what happens in here is the Radius timeout, it doesn't have enough time for the system to dial out to the MFA service and then complete that call in order to sign in. So we're adding that as a feature right now to our MFA Radius SSO domain service, so we don't have that problem. So that kind of wraps up our presentation and demo, so I'll send that back to Rinchin.
Thank you, Kurt. If you have any questions, please type them in and we'll be addressing them right now. But in the meantime, I'd like to remind everyone that today's webinar is being recorded, and we will have the recording available on our website in the next 24 hours. In addition to that, if you are joining today's webinar to get CompTIA CEUs, today's webinar does qualify for continuing education units for CompTIA certifications for Security Plus only. So you will receive an email confirmation from GoToWebinar confirming your attendance, and you can use that email as proof when submitting for that one CEU through your CompTIA portal. I also pasted the link to download today's slides earlier when we started off the webinar. I'm going to do that right now for those of you who attended a little late. I don't have any questions so far. I had a couple of questions about the continuing education units, and I've addressed them via chat bar as well. But if you have any questions for Kurt or Bhargav, please send them in the chat bar. If not, of course, while you are viewing the recording, if you come up with questions, you feel free to email them to us at webinar@netcomlearning.com, and we'll be sure to forward them to Kurt and Bhargav. Kurt, Bhargav, do you have anything else to add?
Well, I want to thank Kurt for a great job here of presenting, but I wanted to add, like Kurt mentioned, the requirement of two-factor authentication is something that has historically been a problem for Exchange Link, especially in secure environment where two-factor is a requirement. With recent advancements in protocols both in Link and Exchange, the ability to configure is providing you great ability like Kurt demonstrated today. And with Azure giving you the flexibility, you don't need to have your own infrastructure on hand for calling people or sending the text for two-factor authentication, which is a great service from Azure. So just want to put that out there, that if you aren't considering Azure because it's cloud offering, as Kurt demonstrated, it's not only applicable to cloud offering either, which is great. You will be able to open up some doors for your on-premise deployments where second factor authentication might be a requirement.
And Bhargav, I've assigned a question to you from Marcus. If you can kindly read the question out, and then you can address it.
Absolutely. So the question is, what is the importance of having a load balancer in front of WAP and ADFS? Well, when you look at ADFS, ADFS is of course single point of failure, and so is WAP. WAP itself is a single point of failure. So what's the point of deploying a solution that doesn't have availability for something critical like using authentication? If you're going to offload your authentication, whether in case of Exchange Link or in Office 365, you're using your Active Directory to sync with ADFS. Either way, you want to make sure that is highly available, and what are you going to use with WAP and ADFS to provide that high availability? Natural progression there would be a load balancer.
And the next
question actually...
Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, I have it. So that's, does Kemp has any MFA solutions for on-prem servers like Exchange and Link servers? If I'm not wrong, it was Azure which we saw. Correct me if I'm wrong. So Gulab, that is correct. What you saw was Azure. Azure provides the second factor authentication. However, like Kurt showed, when you set up the Azure piece, that provides you the second factor authentication similar to RSA or something. But when you set up Exchange, Exchange connection from client is being terminated on load balancer. Load balancer then provides the second factor authentication query going from Kemp load balancer to Azure, the ADFS radius piece that Kurt demonstrated earlier. So yes, we do come into the picture if you're using Exchange. If you're using Lync, you don't really need Kemp load balancer to be in between that authentication piece. Once you pass that, the rest of course is handled by Kemp for the normal regular traffic.
Okay, I don't see any more questions. One more for Marcus Bhargav. I'll let you read the question as well.
All right, let me see. Is it possible to use a single pair of load balancers with legs in DMZ and LAN for web and ADFS, especially from a security point of view? Many of my customers don't want to spend money for two pairs. Yes, it is possible. You certainly can do that. The real question is if, like you mentioned, Marcus, if this is security-minded environment where they're asking for security. From security point of view, I will argue against it because you're putting your single pair of load balancer out there both for internet traffic as well as internal clients. If there is a DDoS attack or something of that source where your DMZ is compromised, even if load balancer is not, if it sees high spike in volume, you would be affecting both internal and external clients. What you might want to do is separate the pairs. If you think about sizing, when you combine internal and external client traffic onto one load balancer pair, your requirement of sizing might go up. If you split that across to two, ultimately it comes out to similar size divided into two, so you can easily go with two pairs but a smaller model of a load balancer. And net you would gain the flexibility while not spending as much money. While it sounds like two separate pairs, yes it does, but you're still accounting for only half as much traffic because internal is going to internal pair of load balancers, external going the other way.
And there's another question from James Bhargav.
Okay. And the question is, how does this work across multiple data centers in a high available configuration and or DR solution? In fact, Kurt, this question is great if you want to answer that from geo perspective.
Yeah, so part of our solution is we do have a GSLB solution, so we can actually, I'm no longer sharing my screen, but within the LoadMaster, we can actually have load balancers in two remote locations, and doing that type of geo-redundancy, should you lose a whole data center, all that traffic can be directed to the secondary or DR data center that is in your colo or what have you. Now, from an MFA solution, right, it's really a, again, it's primary, secondary, so there really is no limitation as far as any kind of shared, storage or anything like that, that these need to be more of a cluster. So you can actually have these across multiple locations, and if you lose one, you can actually, from an MFA, an internal on-premise MFA server, the second one can pick up that traffic and work just as fine. Now, you wouldn't be able to do any additional configuration because, again, the master is down, but from a functionality perspective, it'll work just fine.
Perfect. And please, Kurt, feel free. Yeah.
Yeah, I saw that you handed over the reins, but again, I don't think we need to really get too much into that. But so again, you can have the high availability of your application with the Geo or the GSLB from our load balancers, and then from an MFA solution, a high availability, you would just have multiple MFA servers separated across the two data centers.
Great. Any more questions? Going once, twice, up. There's another question. So I'm gonna pass it on to Bhargav from Gulab.
Okay. Okay. So the question is, I'm a little confused. So Kemp is used for load balancing the request to Azure, not that Kemp has any on-prem MFA solution. So let me clarify that a little bit, Gulab. The way it works is your request for login to Exchange is coming from client to the load balancer. The request then, because on Kemp you have enabled pre-authentication with forms-based authentication, we take the authentication, but we allow you to configure radius, which goes to the Azure MFA component, which is also installed on one of the ADFS servers like Kurt demonstrated, that's on-prem. Loadmaster then takes your authentication, makes sure your username and password is correct, then passes it on to ADFS component, Azure MFA component, which is running on the same or a different server. Once the request is passed on to that, Exchange is not yet in the picture. Your request is authenticated by Azure by sending you a phone call or text or using the app. And once that response comes back, it comes back to us on the Kemp Loadmaster. And Kemp Loadmaster then takes that request, and since it sees the success from Azure, it passes on and allows the user connection which was held to pass on to Exchange. I hope that makes sense, and if not, happy to answer any follow-up question.
Okay, Gulab says that did make sense. Okay, so I'm going to let our audience some time. I'm going to give some time for them to think about other questions they might have. Don't want to end the session and and they have some questions for Bhargav and Kurt. So just to remind everyone, if you want access to the recording of today's webinar, if you go to netcomlearning.com and click on webinars and events, this is where we list all our upcoming live webinars and events on top. If you scroll down, this is where we list the recently completed webinars. So today's webinar will be archived here in the next 24 hours, so you can have access to it. You can have free access to the webinar. So it looks like there are no more questions popping up in the chat bar. Kurt, Bhargav, do you think we should close out today's session, or I think Gulab has another request, and assign that to you, Bhargav? Bhargav?
Oh, sorry, I was talking on mute to myself. So the question is this configuration of MFA available on Kemp's site or my personal blog? No, this configuration is not available online at the moment. We will make it available on Kemp website as a white paper and the deployment guide. It's just not yet available.
Next question from...
Yeah, before we publish that...
Go ahead, Kurt.
I'm sorry, no, I was just going to follow up on Bhargav. And before we publish that, we wanted to add that timeout section to the SSO domain. We didn't want to publish that and have, it being, again, a little unstable because of the timeout issue. So once that's, and again, that's a real easy fix to add that timeout option within the SSO domain, and it's in development right now. So we'll be, we'll be posting that shortly after that.
Perfect. Next question, will it support layer 4 or layer 7 for Exchange?
Sorry, Kurt, you taking that question?
I'm sorry, Richard, you broke up a little bit.
Oh, sorry about that. The question reads, will it support layer 4 or layer 7 for Exchange?
We support both layer 4 and layer 7 for Exchange. So, yes, both.
However, if you want to do a multi-factor authentication, the only way you can do that is you have to have a layer 7 configuration. Without that, we have no ability to intercept the logon request, which then doesn't allow us to service the pre-authentication and multi-factor support.
Yes, correct, sorry, yes. We need to intercept that.
I see some hand raised icon. So you can simply type your questions in the chat bar, because the hand raise option, we pretty much ignore those, but you can please, if you have questions, concerns, just type them in the questions pane. I don't see any. Another one from Gulab. Bhargav, would you like to take that one?
Yes, I'll take that. Give me a sec. Look. All right, and the question is, if that requires layer 7 load balancer, then what difference is going to make Exchange 2013 as it supports layer 4? Well, you have to understand Exchange supports layer 4. That doesn't mean that is appropriate for every situation that you're trying to address. Most situations require understanding of what you actually need. If you want to use layer 4, that's fine. We support layer 4 and layer 7. The question is, do you want to use dual factor authentication using the method that we demonstrated? And if you do, how we as a load balancer can be enabled in order to support that. Now, if you do layer 4, load balancer, whether it's ours or someone else's, doesn't matter. It has no ability to look into traffic. It has no idea when a user is requesting authentication. And if we have no visibility into traffic, how are we going to support pre-authentication with dual factor? We simply cannot. It's certainly a choice of a customer to decide what works for them and what meets their requirements. Not all requirements are met by layer 4. It's a great solution if you want to simplify your setup. If you want to move pre-authentication to the backend, you can certainly do that. And if you configure Exchange to do the multi-factor authentication, you can simply use LoadMaster to do a layer 4, pass through the request to Exchange, and make sure Exchange is configured to then prompt you for two-factor authentication, which will change the behavior. It's the pros and cons. You have to weigh them out and see what works with your requirements. Each requirement is different, each customer is different, and each deployment is different. There is no single answer to all those problems, unfortunately.
Bhargav, Gulab has a comment about the previous question.
Yeah. And it's not a question but a request. I hope that in the document we have all available options for authentication like call, text, message, etc. Yes, that's understandable. When we publish the documentation for this MFA, we will certainly account for all possible scenarios that we can cover.
Absolutely.
I have one more question, Bhargav. I'll assign that to you.
Yeah, looking at it. Since client access server array isn't introduced for Exchange 2013, how does it load balance the connectivity respect to mailbox? The question is quite honestly off topic, but I'll take a moment to quickly answer that. The way it works is the load balancing client access server is a stateless, it's a strict proxy in 2013. You do not need to have a CAS array object like you used to have in Exchange 2010. However, when you send the request to any of the client access servers, it will proxy that request to the mailbox server where the mailbox is active.
Okay. So I think we can close out today's session. If you have additional questions, you can of course email them to us at webinar@netcomlearning.com. But I'd like to take this moment to thank Kurt and Bhargav for that excellent demo and a very interactive Q&A session. Thanks to all attendees for the questions as well. And I will make sure to archive today's recording on our website for free access. Kurt, Bhargav, do you have any last words before we close out today's session?
So I just want to quickly mention that if our attendees today on the webinar wants to try out the load balancer in their lab, if they're testing, if they're preparing for an exam, whatever the case may be, you can download our load balancer from kemptechnologies.com. The trial is free for 30 days with all the features and functionality. And if you're a Microsoft certified MCP, you can actually get an NFR copy for free, which you can use for your lab use only with a full license. So that's a great offering. I wanted to mention. It seems the audience is right and they will benefit from it. And then lastly, I want to say thank you everyone for attending and making it a great interactive session.
Thank you, everyone, and have a great holidays, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Kurt.
Thank you. Thank you.